Welcome to eAssist Growing Your Dental Business podcast. Tune in as the experts in dental business share tips and tools to grow your practice. To learn more, visit dentalbilling.com. Please welcome our next guest.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Growing Your Dental Business podcast. I'm your host, Jacquelyn Hurley, and today we're diving into one of my favorite subjects, and that is how systems create success. And I'm just really excited to be here today, but we're going to talk specifically about oral and maxillofacial surgery practices. You know, the stakes are kind of high and the pace is fast in these practices. And that's why I'm excited to welcome Scott Graham to the show. He partners with OMS practices across the nation to help solve their most significant operational challenges, things like workflow breakdowns, inconsistent processes, and gaps in staff training. And so he's an expert in practice analysis, checklists, policies, and procedures. And while those might sound like small details, they are truly the backbone of a practice that runs smoothly, efficiently, and profitably. So Scott is also the founder of SOMSA, which used to be called the JAWS Society, which is a national organization for OMS practice administrators. And he brings decades of experience to helping practices move from chaos to clarity with better systems. So whether you're a leading OMS office or simply want to understand how stronger systems can transform any dental practice, this conversation will give you practical tips that you can start using right away. Scott, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jacquelyn. It's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Oh, well, I love having you here today. You know, I started thinking, how in the world did you ever get into practice management for oral surgeons?
Well, that's a funny story. So I worked in a level 1 trauma center in St. Louis, and I was the administrator of an orthopedic practice. And just down the hall, it was the residency program that we had. It was oral and maxillofacial surgery. So I'd see the residents run around, and what piqued my interest is that they dealt with facial trauma, and they took me into the OR, although I saw hip replacements and knees. But what really piqued my interest was the OMF. So I got to know the residents on a personal level. They would take me to the OR, and then they would show me some of these cool surgeries they would do, the facial trauma, since we were in a level 1 trauma center. And then the administrator was leaving, so that was kind of my back door to just to slide in. I didn't really have to move far. I just moved my books and a box and just down the hall and started there. We had a residency program and then created a fellowship opportunity, and we grew that practice. Been there probably 25 years. And we had 5 locations, 8 doctors, and I lost all my hair. And then I kind of got into practice management or consulting because a lot of the residents and fellows would reach out to me and say, "Hey, Scott, I would like to start my business. I'd like to buy a practice. Can you help?" So that was kind of the impetus for me to go into consulting. So I quit my day job and I got into consulting to work with other oral surgeons across the nation. So never looked back, and I thoroughly enjoy my job because I get to help people, and that's my passion.
I love it. Wow, it's amazing. You know, typically you kind of fall into things like this because you are kind of put in the trenches like you were to grow that business, and you did, and then other people start paying attention. So then you become a specialist in all of that. So that's fantastic. I love it. So one of the things that people might not be familiar with is, and I think this might be one of the first things that you do, is do a practice analysis. When you first meet an oral surgeon who might want your help, I'm guessing that's the first step. Can you kind of walk us through what that looks like, what you evaluate, all those kind of things?
And funny, I lecture on this topic, and the best analogy I could use is, let's just say you're going to go to your doctor, and as you know, they use diagnostic tests. They do x-rays, they do mammograms, they do echocardiograms, and in addition to blood work. So they basically look at your body, they do blood work. And then I use that analogy to work with other practices. So I go in and I ask them, what's their chief complaint? And a lot of times they say, well, Scott, I just have what do I call a goat show, pardon my terminology, but it's kind of chaos. And so I said, what we should do is dive a little deeper into your practice. Let me study your workflow. Let me study your policies and procedures and your job descriptions. Let me talk to your employees. Let me find out what the chief complaint. Let me look at your tools that you're using, your phone system, your computer system, as well as then I dive deeper into the practice management piece. I'll go and run reports and I'll start to look at the financials. I'll look at their charges, their collections, their adjustments. And then it basically opens up to this Pandora's box. And then now you know what is going on in a practice. And so now that I've studied the practices, and then I can tell the doctors based on, the years of benchmarking and KPIs, I now have I use that analogy with blood work. How you go in there and you look at your cholesterol level, your A1C, and they give you a range in what should be normal. Well, in oral surgery, I have those are published benchmarks, and then I could present to the doctors or the practice, say, hey, here's your collection ratio, here's your adjustments, this is what's off, this what can be improved. So it basically paints a picture of what's going on in the practice. And then from there, we know what the chief complaint is. Then we can dive down and do some additional tests, like running reports, improving the workflow, understanding the staff and where the breakdown of communication. And then from there, I put together a nice little packet of my analysis. And then I provide that. And that's basically how I sell my services to the clients based on our findings and recommendations.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you do a deep enough dive that you figure out really what are the true pain points, and then you kind of know where to start or where to begin with that practice. Do you have any examples of maybe a practice analysis that completely changed the way a client had operated?
Yeah, it's funny that most of the practices, I shouldn't say most, but some practices, they don't have KPIs, key performance indicators. So, for example, I'll dive into their profit loss statement on that side because the doctors normally see the expenses. They'll see, for example, they spent $10,000 in dental implants, but they don't realize they have a staff turnover and this employee has probably $20,000 in inventory. So nobody ever puts together the production reports from the practice management side compared to the financials, the profit loss. And you compare the two, and now it gives you a financial picture. Say, okay, I placed 1,000 implants, but I spent $10,000 on implants. So things don't connect. What I did is I put together some benchmarks, some data. I think the biggest drive is data. You got to have the data. So I put together a dashboard report of basically what your financials are as compared to your to your production reports. Okay. So then you kind of compare the two, and it really opens up the doctor's eyes. You share that with the employees, and then they'll understand a better inventory system. They'll understand the whole practice, how it runs. And we made a lot of changes that way. Wow,
so do practices kind of push back, or do you find that they conform to some of your changes that you want to make?
That's a great question, Jacquelyn. So I found that what I've learned over the years, you could take the horse to water, you could present all the findings, and it's up to the doctors or the group if they want to choose to go that route. Yeah. But I can't force or change behavior. That's the biggest issue I face is changing behavior, because if people really don't want to do it, they're not going to make the change. They just basically say, thank you very much, Scott, for bringing that up. I'll take it under the advisement, and then it's up to them. But as my services is basically provide the findings and recommendations.
Recommendations. Yeah, that's important. What have you noticed are some of the biggest challenges in a practice today?
I think the number one complaint that I hear, not only in oral surgery, dentistry, and most all industries, is staffing. Because I think today is recruiting and retaining staff. And I've always given them some pearls, and I like to share this little story because I'm from St. Louis, and you got to know my personality. I'm very outgoing. And in St. Louis, we had a community college. They had a dental assisting program, and I got to know the program director. And as you know, that if you have a position, a lot of the most time people just run ads, and it's just something that it's not very fruitful, that you run an ad and you may get one or two candidates and you're lucky if they show up. So I've discovered over the years, it's a paradigm shift. So you can't just place an ad. You got to go after those candidates. And I use the analogy like a sports team. They have a team that has talent. So in the event that your pitcher gets hurt, they can always go to the farm league and pull up that pitcher, or they'll have another person on the bench. So I advocate to all these practices, you got to go out and you got to recruit, and you got to be proactive. You go to your universities, the training, or the universities, community colleges, the trade schools, and you got to recruit people. Go to high school, job fairs, pull these people in, and you have to, unfortunately, recruit talent versus just placing an ad.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So do you look for, say, skills versus aptitude, or what do you look for when you're hiring?
That is another excellent question, Jacquelyn. So I've discovered, I use this acronym. It's called the BAR: brains, attitude, reliability. And I know today, a lot of times people are so desperate, they just hire. If the person has a pulse, they're hired. And I say that's the wrong thing, because they're so desperate. You're just looking for anybody who would just reply to your ad. And if somebody shows up, they hire them, which I don't advocate that, because in today's world, I advocate you find the person, you teach the skills. You got to find those behavioral, or I should say, ask those behavioral questions in an interview, because you got to get the right people on your team. You can't have the same personalities, the type A's. They're going to clash. You're going to put two alphas in the same area, they're going to clash. So you always have to complement your staff they complement each other. Yeah. And I'll have to send you a link about those behavioral questions to ask. And once you find those people, then you could teach the skills. Right. But like you said, it's those soft skills. It's the etiquette they use, decorum. I teach that. I can teach the skill set. I can give them a checklist, but how do I find somebody to be polite, reliable, passionate?
Yeah, no, it is. You want them to be, you want them to love what they do too, and you want to find just the right fit. And so that's a tricky part of the equation. And when there's a shortage, people do find themselves desperate. And so it's like, oh, we just need to get someone in here. Who are we going to get? And sometimes it's worth just the team bucking up and just dealing with being short-staffed until they find the right person. So
that's true. And then I also tell my clients to be proactive. So when you run an ad, the first thing this candidate's going to do, they're going to look you up. They're going to look at your website. They're going to look at your social media platforms. And you're going to be an advocate of showing these potential candidates you're a fun place to work. So I tell them, always get some staff photos, advocate that, hey, Jacquelyn's been here 10 years, or today's her birthday, today's her anniversary. Promote that, because that's what people want to see. They want to go to a fun-loving practice that they're very employee-friendly. Because if you just treat the employees like employees are going to work for your money, if you treat them like family, as they say, they'll die on the sword for you. So that's what I try to advocate to my clients is you got to attract those people, because if you don't have a good well-run office with policies and procedures. It's the blind lead the blind. It's, as I call it, the goat show, because then there's so much turnover. Then that's probably the biggest cause, because nobody likes to work for an unorganized practice.
Yeah, my daughter had kind of that experience. She was an office manager for a pediatric dentist, and he kind of brought her in with no dental experience. He taught her everything on the job.
Right.
And it started out as an assistant, and she would just and then she took over the back end and started ordering all the supplies. And pretty soon he asked her to be the office manager. And she just really thrived in that environment. And she just wanted to do anything she could for him. He was so good to her and her team. And he retired and she no longer works there, but she is like best friends with some of the gals that she met in that environment. And you do become family.
Yes.
Really do become family. So it really is important on both sides to make sure it's the right fit.
For sure. And I always tell the doctors this. I said it starts with the doctors. You can have a great staff, well-educated, well-trained, but if the doctors aren't emotionally checked and they scream at their employees, they allow a lot of things to go on, then your employees are going to quit. So I always advocate, and I tell this to the doctors, it starts with you, doctor, that you got to have your stuff together before you have a good staff, because you're the leader. You set the tone, you set the culture, the vibe.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to work for that type of environment.
Yeah, no kidding. I love that. That's, I think, great advice. So another thing that I've seen that you emphasize sometimes is the power of checklists. And honestly, I love a good checklist. It sounds simple, but I'll write out all the lists of things I need to do in a day. And it's just so rewarding to kind of check all that off. And, and some people might think, oh, do you need checklists in a surgical practice? But so why is that crucial, and how can that be a game changer?
Oh, that's a great question. So I use this analogy. It's, what is the safest transportation in the world? It's airlines, because airlines are very redundant, because they do a pre-check. They go through their checklist before the flight, and after they land, they go through a post checklist. So I always use that analogy. It's like, how can we apply this checklist to a busy oral surgery? Because who has the time to do a pre and a post check? So I think it's very important to have morning huddles, and everybody's on the same page. They look at the schedule. They look at, if the types of implants they have that day. Do they have the instruments, things that they need to get through the day? So I advocate for the new hires. A lot of times the new hires, they're not familiar with the way the office runs. And it's an easy task if you give an individual a checklist, like in the front desk. The first thing they do is maybe turn on the lights, print the schedule, get, all these tasks in order. And it's easy for them to all check that off. So I find that it helps the workflow. And if there's any misses, then they can address them the next day at their morning huddles. But I think it's imperative that practices have checklists that they can go over.
I love it. Do you ever get pushback on checklists?
Well, it's changing behavior again. Very good, Jacquelyn. So what I do is I tell them it's important, because, yeah, you're right. So a lot of times doctors are jaded and cynical, and they kind of roll their eyes and say, well, Scott, I've been doing this for 30 years. And yes, doctor, I understand. But what about this new hire, this new person you just hired? They have no clue of what oral maxillofacial surgery is and what procedures you perform. So break it down for them. Make it simple for the employees to understand, and then they can buy into it. So yes, I do get the pushback, but they're not just written in stone. As you know, things change, Jacquelyn. The compliance changes. Maybe you'll find another approach to improve the flow, the patient's safety. Maybe there's additional things that they'll have to add, but then you're always revising that checklist and always going over that. I think it's imperative. If you look at medicine, you look at the hospitals today in the OR, they go through the checklist. I know it's kind of silly, They'll ask you what's your name, what's your date of birth, what knee are we working on today? So they have a simple checklist. So I use that, apply that to to oral surgery, not just in the back, but in the front as well. Because sometimes you'll hear those horror stories. Well, I didn't get the insurance information. I didn't get the group number. And so then that trickles down to the billing department when they submit the claim. So if you have these checklists in the front, then everything flows to the back.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I feel like, and you've talked a little bit about checklists, and then you've talked a little about writing everything in stone. What's the difference between just a checklist and then formal policies and procedures? Is there a difference there?
There is, because you have to set the tone and the culture when somebody walks in. They want to, for example, the new hire wants to understand, okay, what are the working hours? What is the expectations from me? How do I get evaluated, and how do I get paid? How do I get bonuses? And they want to know everything is transparent. And what about time off? How is that accrued? And if you have something all written out, then it allows more clarity for the new hires, because it basically lays out the way the expectations, the rules, so to speak, the time off, and it basically sets up the culture, the expectations of a practice. So nothing's nebulous. So everything is transparent and they understand. So it's not, the rules don't change every day, because you'll hear that. There's no continuity. So it's very important. And, those are flexible too. They're not always set. I tell everybody to change those every year. And you go over and you see what has changed and what's in today's environment. Everything is changing. The landscape's changing. So always revise your policies and procedures. So therefore, then the new hires will understand the expectations. And that's your feedback.
That makes total sense. I feel like, because it's one thing to read through everything too, but then if you have a question, you can always go back and look and read through it and just double check if, it just helps clarify everything, and it makes it so much simpler. Plus, it kind of helps the team stay more accountable.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
You could talk about your attendance policy. You could talk about the vacation accrual and pension and all those things. Instead of just giving that lip service, it's nice to have that policies and procedures and an employee handbook on your hard drive, so everybody can look at that. So if they have questions about FMLA, maternity leave, how does all this work? And then you can always, refer to that check or to that policies and procedures and employee handbook.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What is one of the most overlooked areas when you recommend practices develop or update their policies? Is there anything that practices tend to neglect?
They do. Compliance is always changing, the landscape of compliance. So it's imperative then in oral surgery, it's now is kind of when the kids go back to school, because they're all going off to high school and college. This is the time to then look at your policies and procedures, because sometimes they get forgotten. They don't, there isn't the training, so to speak, the dealing with the anesthesia. So it's nice to go and get, look at the OSHA training, the HIPAA training, the bloodborne pathogens, and a lot of things may have changed, and you may want to implement that now and get your employees to sit down now that we can get together as a group and go over those. But sometimes they don't. They kind of complacent and they don't review that, and you don't want something to happen and say, oh, well, we weren't aware of that. So it's always important to regroup, and this is the time to do it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Just to stay on top of all of that training, I'm sure it's just a big it's something that they get so busy day to day that unless they have it like on the schedule, maybe as part of their policies, to maybe go through all of that during 1 month of the year, and they just automatically do that or something so that they can all stay up to date. That sounds awesome. So what is happening in today's practices that you've seen? Is there anything that you can think of that you'd like to add as far as helping an oral surgeon be, just kind of be on top of everything? What is happening?
It's a little bit, I could say probably the top three is the staffing. It's hard to find, recruit, and retain. That's probably the biggest one.
Yep.
The second, I would say, is probably the compliance piece of it. And then the insurance. The insurance, everybody complains because the insurance companies, they just find it more difficult for us or put on more burden with these pre-certs, verification, or modifiers, the way you bill. If you just don't have everything just right, they're going to kick back, and that just stifles your cash flow. So it's important to stay on top of that. And that's why I like, and I'm going to segue into the eAssist, because you have these OMS services that you provide. And that's a complaint that a lot of the doctors that I hear is they don't have the staff or they don't have the expertise. And I said, nowadays, due to the staffing shortage, it's outsource your services. So that's kind of what we're doing now, because instead of having an FTE, a full-time employee, they're outsourcing their services, the credentialing that you provide, the billing that you provide, the fee negotiations that you provide. So that helps practices, because then they can then focus on, patient care and not deal with all the administrative burdens that they deal with.
I love that. There's so much involved when it comes to submitting clean claims. eAssist has a family of brands. eAssist is all about collecting, but before they can collect, they have Practice Booster to help with all the coding. That was Dr. Charles Blair's organization. And then they've got Unitas PPO Solution that does help with all of those PPO participation and negotiating those reimbursements. So I love that you kind of brought that up, because I feel like those really are the 3 C's: collecting, coding, and contracts or credentialing. I guess that's 4 C's.
Yes.
Kind of a big part of the revenue cycle that kind of helps those claims get, we want every doctor to get exactly, all of that he's earned, right? They work hard clinically and they need to be able to collect everything that they're rightfully owed, especially from the insurance companies. So thank you for sharing that. That was really nice. I do feel like outsourcing is a big part of the puzzle right now. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to pull in before we close today?
No, what I would advocate is more. I know this sounds, everybody rolls their eyes, but I think in today's world, if you look at the DSOs, the way they're pushing their practices is data. Everything is data driven, because a lot of times these practices, if we don't have the data, then how can we manage it? Mm-hmm. And so now what they have, I've seen other, the dental industry is that they have, benchmarks, KPIs, and then you got to bring your employees into that, because you want them to feel like they're part of the solution. Show the employees of what they produced. If you look at a general dentist office, you'll look at the hygiene production, they'll look at their revenue, the expenses, and then everybody then can rally behind that and look at, say, hey, we need to get a couple more patients in the door. With the phones, the software now, they can track phone calls, and, how can we then make our schedules more efficient? And you bring in all those tools into a practice. And I know as technology evolves, this is something that I tell everybody to grab onto, because you'll just start to see the AI, getting into these practices and how we can track and make practices more efficient and boost our, the patient satisfaction as well. It's a lot to capture, but once you capture that data, it's so important, then you can effectively manage your practice.
Right. So if someone was interested in getting a practice analysis from you, Scott, what is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
They could just reach out via email or phone. We've got a website on social media.
Okay. What is your email address? Do you want to give it?
Sure. It's Scott at OMS Consulting Firm.
Okay. .com.
.com, yes. And then my practice website is OMS Consulting Firm. And I have an Instagram, a Facebook, and it's all OMS Consulting Firm.
Nice. So they can check you out before they ever even call if they want or check.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, like I said, we could talk over the phone, talk to them about their chief complaints, really what they're needing. Because not everybody wants a full analysis. Maybe they'll want me to come out and look at their finances, or they may want me to then focus on the flow of the office, the patient flow, the workflow, and just study a few areas, and I can dissect that. Or if they want me to dive deeper into the fee schedules and negotiating fees. So that's why I always, depend on eAssist. So I like your services. So there's things that in my wheelhouse I would, prefer to outsource.
Well, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And honestly, if you are in need, if you're an oral surgeon and you're thinking, just listening to this podcast today, I could really use Scott's services. Maybe I need his help just to kind of take a peek into, what's going on in my practice. So, everybody wants to be efficient. Everybody wants to be able to be more productive. And I think Scott can help you do that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our podcast today. We're excited that you're here. We appreciate Scott taking the time to be here today and to educate us all about, just calming the chaos in oral surgery practice. We appreciate that. And thank you, Scott.
Well, thank you, Jacquelyn. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And everyone take care, and we'll see you next time.
The purpose of this podcast is to interview the consultants within our eAssist Consultant Network. This podcast is for informational purposes only. For more details, please visit the homepage of this podcast platform at dentalbilling.com. Thanks for listening.